The radio frequency went silent at exactly the moment ground controllers expected confirmation. A single reconnaissance aircraft had entered East German airspace at high altitude, visible on radar, tracked by multiple stations. Then the signal changed. The aircraft descended into a weather front that meteorologists had flagged as unsafe for flight operations. Controllers waited for the pilot to emerge on the other side. The aircraft never appeared where calculations said it should. By the time interceptors reached the projected coordinates, they found nothing. The reconnaissance mission continued. The intercept failed. This was not the first time weather had interfered with air defense tracking, but the pattern emerging from this incident contradicted standard evasion doctrine. Reconnaissance pilots flying over denied territory followed established procedures. Maintain altitude, maintain speed, rely on performance advantages to outrun threats. Deliberate entry into severe weather violated those procedures. It introduced structural stress, navigation uncertainty, and instrument failure risk. No tactical manual recommended it. Yet the mission succeeded, specifically because the pilot abandoned the manual. The aircraft involved was a variant designed for high-altitude photography over contested airspace. Its operational profile assumed clear conditions at altitudes where weather systems typically did not reach. Crews trained for scenarios involving visual detection, radar tracking, and high-speed pursuit. They did not train for cloud penetration under combat conditions. The weather front the pilot entered that day contained turbulence severe enough to damage control surfaces and icing conditions that could disable engines. Standard risk assessment would have classified entry as unacceptable. The pilot entered anyway. Interceptor doctrine in the early 1950s assumed predictable target behavior. Fighter controllers calculated intercept geometry based on known aircraft performance, standard evasion maneuvers, and the physical limits of speed and altitude. If a reconnaissance aircraft maintained 40,000 feet at 450 knots, intercept vectors could be plotted with reasonable accuracy. Ground-controlled intercept systems depended on this predictability. When targets deviated from expected parameters, intercept probability dropped significantly, but deviation into hazardous weather was not considered a rational choice. It appeared more likely to destroy the aircraft than to preserve it. The weather system in question extended from approximately 15,000 to 35,000 feet, with embedded cumulonimbus cells. Radar returns showed continuous coverage across the projected flight path. Penetration would require sustained instrument flight through conditions that caused spatial disorientation, even in experienced pilots. Lightning activity indicated severe electrical disturbance. Icing probability was rated extreme. The reconnaissance aircraft carried cameras and electronic equipment sensitive to both mechanical shock and temperature variation. Exposure to these conditions risked mission failure, even if the airframe survived. Yet the intercept failed completely. Fighter aircraft reached the area where the reconnaissance aircraft should have exited the weather system. They found clear air and empty sky. Radio direction finding could not locate the target. Radar coverage showed no contacts matching the expected profile. The reconnaissance aircraft had effectively disappeared during the weather penetration, and when it reappeared, it was no longer where defensive systems anticipated. The mission continued without further engagement. Film recovered later confirmed successful photography of denied installations. Intelligence analysis after the mission focused on the gap between interception doctrine and observed results. Controllers had tracked the reconnaissance aircraft continuously until weather entry. Calculations placed intercept probability above 70% if the target maintained course and altitude. Instead, the target descended into conditions that should have been more dangerous than interception itself. The choice suggested either equipment failure, forcing emergency descent, or deliberate tactical innovation. Equipment telemetry showed no failures. The descent was controlled and intentional. This introduced a problem for air defense planning. If reconnaissance aircraft could evade interception by accepting weather penetration risk, then intercept doctrine required modification. But modification assumed weather penetration was survivable and repeatable. Early analysis suggested it was neither. The weather system encountered was unusually severe. The aircraft that penetrated it was not designed for all weather operations. The pilot's experience level was above average, but not exceptional. Replicating the evasion required either accepting high loss rates or developing new aircraft capabilities that did not yet exist. Fighter forces trained to intercept targets that behaved predictably. Pilots learned geometry, closure rates, and weapons employment against targets following established patterns. Ground controllers learned to vector interceptors based on known performance parameters. The system worked when targets prioritized survival through speed and altitude. It failed when targets accepted risk in exchange for unpredictability. Weather penetration was one form of that trade-off. Others included terrain masking, electronic deception, and extreme altitude variation. Each technique reduced intercept probability by increasing risk to the penetrating aircraft. The reconnaissance mission that succeeded through weather penetration was not isolated. Similar incidents occurred across multiple theaters during the same period. Some involved weather, others involved terrain or unusual flight profiles. The common element was unpredictability. Aircraft that deviated from standard procedures often evaded interception, but they also experienced higher accident rates. Losses to weather, terrain, and mechanical failure increased when operational risk tolerance increased. Air forces had to balance mission success against aircraft survival. Meteorological data from the period shows that severe weather systems were present over denied territory, frequently enough to provide evasion opportunities, but not so frequently that they could be reliably predicted or planned around. A reconnaissance aircraft departing friendly airspace might encounter suitable weather conditions, or it might not. If conditions were unsuitable, the aircraft would have to rely on conventional evasion or accept interception risk. Weather penetration could not be a primary evasion tactic because it depended on environmental factors outside operational control. The pilot who entered the weather system that day filed a standard post-mission report. The report noted turbulence, icing, and temporary loss of attitude reference. It described control difficulties and equipment stress. It did not describe the maneuver as a planned evasion tactic. Later interviews suggested the decision was made in response to radar warning indications, showing interceptors closing from multiple directions. The weather system offered an immediate alternative to engagement. The pilot accepted the risks of penetration rather than the certainty of interception. The choice was situational, not doctrinal. Air defense systems in the early Cold War period operated under assumptions derived from World War II experience. Radar networks detected aircraft at range, ground controllers calculated intercept geometry, and fighters closed to weapons range using directed vectors. The system required continuous tracking from detection to engagement. Any interruption in tracking created gaps that increased intercept difficulty. Weather systems created such gaps, but they also endangered the aircraft being tracked. Defense planners assumed the danger to the target outweighed the value of breaking radar contact. This assumption held for most operational scenarios. Heavy bombers could not maneuver violently or descend rapidly into weather without risking structural failure. Transport aircraft lacked the performance to evade interceptors through speed or altitude changes. Even fighter aircraft conducting ground attack missions prioritized target approach over evasion complexity. Reconnaissance aircraft were different. They carried no offensive payload and existed solely to observe and return. Their value equation favored survival over all other considerations. If weather penetration increased survival probability despite the risks, then the calculation changed. The specific weather conditions that enabled successful evasion were not constant across geography or season. Frontal systems over Central Europe displayed different characteristics than isolated thunderstorms over lower latitudes. Pilots needed to distinguish between weather that would destroy their aircraft and weather that would merely stress it. The difference was not always evident from external observation. Cloud formations that appeared similar from altitude could contain drastically different internal conditions. Some systems were navigable with care, others were not. Aircraft entering severe weather faced multiple simultaneous hazards. Turbulence induced G-loads that exceeded design limits if encountered at high speed. Icing accumulated on control surfaces and engine inlets, degrading performance and increasing stall risk. Lightning strikes could disable electrical systems and navigation equipment. Hail could shatter canopies and damage skin panels. Visibility dropped to zero, eliminating external references. Instruments became the only source of orientation information, but severe turbulence could cause instrument errors or pilot disorientation that made instruments unreadable. Standard instrument flight training prepared pilots for controlled entry into clouds under stable conditions. It did not prepare them for combat maneuvering inside severe convective systems. The physiological stress of maintaining aircraft control during turbulence, while processing navigation information and monitoring threats, exceeded the workload most pilots trained for. Spatial disorientation was common. Loss of aircraft control was not rare. Some pilots who entered severe weather systems never regained control before ground impact. Yet reconnaissance missions continued to use weather penetration when circumstances allowed. The technique spread informally among pilots who survived its use. No formal doctrine emerged because replicating the conditions required for success was impossible. Each weather system was unique. Each aircraft's tolerance for stress varied with maintenance status and load configuration. Each pilot's ability to maintain control under duress differed. The tactic could not be standardized, but it could be attempted when alternatives appeared worse. Interceptor pilots faced a different problem. Their mission required closing to weapons range against a target that was actively evading. If the target entered weather, interceptors had to choose between pursuit into the same conditions or breaking off the engagement. Pursuit meant accepting the same hazards the reconnaissance aircraft faced, but without the benefit of choosing entry point or timing. Interceptors entered weather blind, relying on ground controller vectors to position them near the target. Radar performance inside weather cells was degraded. Target position estimates became approximate. Collision risk increased. Fighter aircraft of the period were not optimized for instrument flight in severe weather. They were designed for high performance in clear air. Control authority, visibility from the cockpit, and instrument layout all assumed visual reference would be available during critical phases of flight. All-weather interceptor variants existed, but they were heavier, slower, and less numerous than day fighters. When a reconnaissance aircraft entered weather during daylight hours, the interceptors most likely to be scrambled were day fighters with limited instrument capability. Ground controllers could track both the reconnaissance aircraft and the interceptors until weather-obscured radar returns. Once both aircraft were inside the weather system, tracking became intermittent. Position updates arrived seconds or tens of seconds apart, rather than continuously. Intercept geometry calculations became estimates rather than precise solutions. Controllers could vector interceptors toward the last known target position, but if the target maneuvered inside the weather, vectors became obsolete before they could be executed. The reconnaissance pilot inside the weather system had one advantage: singular focus on aircraft control and navigation. Interceptor pilots had to maintain aircraft control while simultaneously searching for a target they could not see, monitoring controller instructions, and preparing weapons systems for employment. The workload disparity favored the reconnaissance aircraft. It needed only to survive the weather and emerge in a location that defeated the intercept geometry. Interceptors needed to survive the weather, locate the target, maneuver into firing position, and employ weapons, all without visual reference and with degraded radar information. Some intercept attempts ended when fighters exited the weather system without having located the target. Others ended when fighters diverted to alternate airfields after consuming too much fuel, searching inside weather cells. A few ended in crashes when interceptor pilots lost control during turbulence or became spatially disoriented. The loss rate among interceptors pursuing targets into severe weather exceeded the loss rate of the reconnaissance aircraft being pursued. Air defense commanders began issuing guidance that discouraged weather penetration during intercept operations, unless conditions were classified as moderate or less. This guidance created an exploitable gap. If reconnaissance pilots could identify weather systems severe enough to deter interceptor pursuit, but survivable with careful technique, they gained a sanctuary that air defenses could not effectively contest. The gap was not absolute. Some weather systems were too severe for any aircraft. Some interceptor pilots ignored guidance and pursued anyway. But the probability of successful evasion increased significantly when reconnaissance aircraft entered weather classified as severe by meteorological standards. The tactical implications of weather evasion forced changes in how air defense systems allocated resources. If reconnaissance aircraft could temporarily disappear into weather systems, then intercept success required either catching the target before weather entry or predicting where it would exit. Both approaches demanded faster reaction times and more accurate trajectory prediction than existing systems provided. Ground radar could track aircraft approaching weather systems, but calculating exit points required assumptions about flight path inside the clouds. Those assumptions were often wrong. Reconnaissance aircraft inside weather systems did not maintain straight and level flight. Pilots maneuvered to avoid the worst turbulence, altered altitude to escape icing layers, and adjusted heading to navigate around embedded thunderstorm cells. These maneuvers were reactive, not planned. They depended on what the pilot encountered inside the weather system. No ground controller could predict them. By the time a reconnaissance aircraft emerged from weather, it could be several miles from its projected position and at a significantly different altitude. Interceptors positioned to engage at the expected exit point found empty sky. The solution required either preventing weather entry or accepting lower intercept rates. Preventing entry meant positioning interceptors closer to reconnaissance aircraft during the initial penetration of denied airspace, before weather systems became available as evasion options. This required earlier detection and faster scramble response. It also required more interceptors on alert status, which increased operational costs and crew fatigue. Air defense forces with limited resources could not maintain high readiness postures indefinitely. Gaps appeared in coverage during crew rest cycles, maintenance periods, and adverse weather conditions that grounded fighters. Accepting lower intercept rates meant acknowledging that some reconnaissance missions would succeed, regardless of defensive efforts. This was strategically unacceptable to commanders responsible for protecting denied territory, but operationally inevitable given the limitations of existing technology. Radar could not see through weather. Fighters could not safely pursue targets into severe turbulence. Weapons systems could not engage targets they could not locate. The physics of the problem created constraints that doctrine could not override. Some air defense organizations responded by developing intercept tactics specifically for weather evasion scenarios. Fighters would establish patrol orbits at multiple altitudes around known weather systems, attempting to catch reconnaissance aircraft as they entered or exited. This distributed defensive resources across larger areas and reduced the concentration of force at any single point. It also assumed reconnaissance aircraft would exit weather systems within the patrol area, which was not guaranteed. If the reconnaissance aircraft changed course significantly inside the weather, it could exit well outside the patrol zone. Other organizations focused on improving radar systems to track aircraft through weather with greater accuracy. Weather radar technology existed, but integrating it with air defense networks required technical development that took years to implement. Early systems could distinguish between weather returns and aircraft returns only under favorable conditions. When aircraft flew deep inside weather cells, radar returns merged and became indistinguishable. Ground controllers lost positive identification of the target and could not confidently direct interceptors even when radar contact persisted. The reconnaissance aircraft that successfully evaded interception through weather penetration established a precedent that influenced subsequent mission planning. Pilots briefed on missions over denied territory, studied meteorological forecasts, and identified potential weather systems along their routes. They did not plan to enter weather, but they prepared for the possibility. Aircraft were configured with additional instrument lighting, backup attitude indicators, and anti-icing equipment when available. Pre-flight briefings included weather avoidance procedures and emergency recovery options. Mission success rates increased for units that incorporated weather evasion into contingency planning. Losses to interception decreased, but losses to weather-related accidents did not increase proportionally. This suggested that careful selection of weather systems and disciplined flight technique could reduce risk to acceptable levels. Pilots learned to distinguish between weather that offered concealment and weather that offered only danger. The learning process was not formalized in manuals, but transmitted through experience and informal mentorship. By the mid-1950s, air defense organizations recognized that weather evasion was a persistent tactical problem without a complete solution. Incremental improvements in radar technology, interceptor performance, and coordination procedures reduced the effectiveness of weather evasion, but did not eliminate it. Reconnaissance aircraft continued to penetrate denied airspace, and some continued to use weather systems as temporary sanctuary when interceptors closed to engagement range. The tactic remained high risk, but operationally viable. The evolution of reconnaissance aircraft design reflected this operational reality. Later variants incorporated improved instrumentation, enhanced structural strength, and better all-weather capability. These improvements made weather penetration less hazardous, which made it more tactically reliable. As reconnaissance aircraft became more capable of surviving severe weather, the advantage shifted further away from air defenses. Interceptors needed not only to match reconnaissance aircraft speed and altitude, but also their ability to operate inside weather systems that degraded radar tracking and visual acquisition. The pilot who first demonstrated successful evasion through weather penetration did not invent the technique. Others had entered weather under combat conditions before, sometimes deliberately and sometimes out of necessity. What distinguished this incident was the documented outcome: complete intercept failure followed by mission success. Intelligence analysis confirmed that the evasion was not accidental, but resulted from a calculated decision to accept weather risk rather than interception certainty. That calculation became part of the tactical knowledge base for reconnaissance operations. No formal recognition followed. The mission remained classified, the pilot's name was not released, and the specific details of the weather penetration were not widely distributed. But the operational lesson propagated through reconnaissance communities across multiple air forces. Weather could be used tactically if the risks were understood and managed. The technique was not suitable for all conditions or all aircraft types, but in specific scenarios, it provided a survival option that standard evasion maneuvers did not. That option changed how reconnaissance missions were planned and how air defenses responded to intrusions. The change was subtle, incremental, and permanent.